New York City, 1991. In quiet back rooms across Brooklyn and Manhattan, Mafia bosses were already saying the same thing. John Gotti's closest ally was finished, not by bullets but by evidence. Federal microphones were inside their meeting places. Prosecutors were building cases that carried life sentences. At the center of that storm stood Gambino underboss Sammy the Bull Gravano, the man who knew more about Gotti's empire than anyone else. What followed would break the Mafia's oldest rule and bring down the most powerful boss in New York. If you value real organized crime history, consider subscribing. December 1985. The coup outside Spark Steakhouse. December 16, 1985. Manhattan, New York. Evening traffic moved through Midtown as Paul Castellano stepped out of a black Lincoln Town car in front of Spark Steakhouse on East 46th Street. The Gambino boss had arrived for a dinner meeting with his driver and bodyguard, Thomas Bellotti. Businessmen hurried past, taxis idled at the curb, and the restaurant lights glowed against the winter dusk. Then, the gunman appeared. Several men approached from both sides of the street and opened fire. Castellano and Bellotti collapsed on the sidewalk within seconds. The attack was quick, public, and unmistakably deliberate. Witnesses later described the gunfire echoing through the block as people scattered. Across the street, John Gotti watched from a parked car. At the time, he was a rising Gambino captain from Queens who had grown deeply dissatisfied with Castellano's leadership. Castellano had shifted the family toward corporate-style rackets and rarely met with street captains, creating resentment within parts of the organization. News reports and historical records later confirmed that this assassination reshaped the leadership of the Gambino crime family and cleared the path for Gotti's rise to power, a moment widely documented in accounts of the Castellano killing. Within days, Gotti emerged as the new boss. But taking power through violence created enemies, scrutiny, and risks that would follow him for years. The man Gotti chose to trust. After the Castellano murder, John Gotti moved quickly to secure control of the Gambino organization. A violent takeover could easily trigger retaliation from rival families or internal factions. To stabilize the family, Gotti needed dependable men in key positions. One of the most important was Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. Gravano had built his reputation in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn during the 1960s and 1970s. Inside Mafia circles, he was known as a disciplined operator and a strong earner. His crews ran construction rackets, trucking operations, and gambling businesses that produced steady profits. Those qualities made him valuable. Organized crime depended not only on intimidation but on reliable revenue streams and careful management. After Gotti consolidated power, Gravano rose quickly through the Gambino ranks. He became one of Gotti's closest advisors and eventually the family's underboss, second only to the boss himself. In that role, Gravano helped manage disputes between crews, supervised business operations, and ensured that money flowed upward through the organization. For John Gotti, loyalty was everything, and for several years, few men appeared more loyal or more essential than Sammy Gravano, the Brooklyn enforcer. Salvatore Gravano grew up in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, where organized crime was part of everyday life in the 1960s. Italian social clubs, bookmakers, and businesses tied to Mafia crews filled the neighborhood. For many young men looking for money and protection, the path into that world was clear. Gravano entered it early. As a teenager, he joined local street crews linked first to the Colombo family and later to the Gambino organization. During this time, he earned the nickname Sammy the Bull after a violent fight that revealed his aggressive reputation. But in Mafia circles, reputation depended on more than violence. Respect came from loyalty and the ability to generate money. Gravano proved he could do both. By the 1970s, he was working with Gambino figures connected to Paul Castellano and later associates tied to John Gotti. He learned how the organization operated as a business, moving money through construction, gambling, trucking, and union influence. Violence enforced discipline, but profit remained the goal. By the early 1980s, Gravano had become a Gambino captain, controlling crews and running profitable rackets, making him one of Gotti's most dependable allies. The Gambino business empire. By the late 1980s, the Gambino crime family operated less like a street gang and more like a complex business network. Beneath John Gotti's leadership, hundreds of soldiers and associates controlled revenue streams spread across New York City. Construction was one of the most valuable sectors. Mafia-controlled companies manipulated bids, influenced union officials, and ensured that certain contractors received major projects. In return, portions of the profits moved quietly back to the organization. Trucking and waste hauling were another critical area. Control over these industries meant influence over how goods moved through the city, from building materials to commercial shipments. Businesses that refused cooperation often found their deliveries delayed, their workers threatened, or their contracts disrupted. Illegal gambling remained a steady source of income. Sports betting operations, card games, and underground casinos operated in neighborhoods across Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. These operations required careful management to avoid attracting law enforcement attention. The Gambino family also relied on legitimate businesses as fronts. Restaurants, construction firms, and small companies allowed money to be mixed with legal revenue and moved through banks without immediate suspicion. As underboss, Sammy Gravano helped supervise much of this system. His role was not only to enforce discipline, but to ensure the enterprise continued generating money. Because in organized crime, power ultimately depended on profit. If you value documented crime history, consider subscribing. The attention Gotti could not avoid. John Gotti led the Gambino family differently from many mafia bosses before him. Earlier leaders stayed hidden, avoided cameras, and conducted business quietly through intermediaries. Gotti did the opposite. By the late 1980s, he had become one of the most recognizable figures in organized crime. Reporters regularly gathered outside the Ravenite social club in Little Italy to photograph him. Newspapers nicknamed him the Dapper Don because of his expensive suits and confident public image. Gotti also faced several criminal trials during this period. Each time he walked out of court acquitted, the publicity only increased. Inside the Gambino family, some saw those victories as proof that he was untouchable. But federal investigators saw a target. Prosecutors in New York began building a long-term racketeering case aimed directly at the Gambino leadership. The FBI expanded surveillance operations and focused on locations where senior members held meetings. Eventually, agents placed hidden microphones inside the Ravenite social club. Conversations that once took place in private were now being recorded. For decades, mafia leaders had relied on secrecy to protect themselves. But Gotti's visibility made that protection far harder to maintain, and the pressure building around the Gambino family would soon reach everyone in its leadership, rivals who saw the danger first. While federal investigators were closing in, other mafia leaders were watching John Gotti with growing concern. The five families of New York operated under an informal balance of power, and stability depended on avoiding unnecessary attention from law enforcement. Gotti's public lifestyle disrupted that balance. His media presence, frequent court appearances, and highly visible meetings at the Ravenite social club made the Gambino family unusually exposed. Rival bosses had spent years learning how to operate quietly. From their perspective, Gotti's approach risked bringing federal pressure onto the entire mafia structure. Inside those circles, a quiet conclusion began to form. If prosecutors succeeded in building a major racketeering case against Gotti, the consequences would extend far beyond him. His closest associates would face the same investigation and the same potential life sentences. Among them, Sammy Gravano stood at the center of the danger. As Gambino underboss, he knew the family's businesses, its leadership decisions, and the details of operations across New York. If investigators ever forced Gravano into a corner, they would be dealing with one of the most informed figures in American organized crime, and some rival bosses had already begun to realize what that might mean. The Ravenite Wiretaps. By the late 1980s, the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Manhattan had become John Gotti's unofficial headquarters. Senior members of the Gambino family met there frequently to discuss business, settle disputes between crews, and pass instructions down the chain of command. For years, conversations inside the club were believed to be protected by the Mafia's code of silence. But federal investigators were already listening. Through a long-term investigation, FBI agents obtained court approval to install surveillance devices near the Ravenite. Hidden microphones began recording conversations between Gotti and members of his inner circle. The tapes captured discussions about gambling operations, construction rackets, internal disputes, and the growing pressure from federal investigations. Some recordings proved particularly damaging. In several conversations, Gotti criticized members of his own leadership group, including Sammy Gravano, blaming them for mistakes that had attracted law enforcement attention. Those comments exposed tensions within the Gambino hierarchy, but they also provided prosecutors with something far more valuable: direct evidence of the organization's leadership discussing its operations. Federal investigators later described how these wiretaps helped build the case that would eventually bring down Gotti. Details documented in the FBI's historical overview of the investigation. The walls of the Ravenite had finally begun to talk. The decision that shattered the code. In December 1990, federal prosecutors unsealed major racketeering indictments against the leadership of the Gambino crime family. John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, and several other senior members were arrested and charged under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, a law created to dismantle organized crime networks. If convicted, both Gotti and Gravano faced the possibility of life in federal prison. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors relied heavily on surveillance evidence. Recordings from hidden microphones near the Ravenite Social Club captured conversations among Gambino leaders discussing the organization's activities. For Gravano, those recordings were dangerous. They revealed how the family operated and tied senior figures directly to criminal acts. At the same time, Gravano discovered that Gotti had been criticizing and blaming him in several recorded conversations. The boss he had helped bring to power was now shifting responsibility onto others. With the prospect of a life sentence growing more real, Gravano began reconsidering his position. For decades, the Mafia had enforced Omertà, a strict code of silence that forbade cooperation with law enforcement. But the pressure was mounting from every direction. In 1991, Sammy Gravano made a decision almost unheard of for a Mafia underboss. He agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors and testify against John Gotti. The trial that ended the Teflon Don, John Gotti's federal trial, began in January 1992 in the U.S. District Court in Manhattan. For years, prosecutors had tried to convict him without success. Witnesses disappeared, juries were compromised, and earlier cases collapsed. Those repeated acquittals earned Gotti the nickname, the Teflon Don. This trial was different. Prosecutors built their case on two key elements: recordings from the Ravenite Social Club and the testimony of Sammy Gravano. As Gambino underboss, Gravano had been present during major decisions within the organization. In court, he explained how the family operated, how money moved through its rackets, and how orders were carried out. Gravano also admitted his role in several organized crime murders. In exchange for his cooperation, prosecutors agreed to a reduced sentence. Jurors also heard recorded conversations of Gotti discussing the family's activities inside the Ravenite. For the first time, prosecutors could present the boss's own voice as evidence. In April 1992, the jury delivered its verdict. John Gotti was convicted on racketeering and murder-related charges and sentenced to life in federal prison without parole. After years of courtroom victories, the man once thought untouchable had finally been brought down. The collapse of an era. John Gotti's conviction marked a major shift in the history of the American Mafia. For decades, organized crime had relied on loyalty and silence to protect its leadership. When Sammy Gravano chose to cooperate with federal prosecutors, that system was deeply shaken. His testimony gave investigators a rare inside look at the structure and operations of the Gambino family. The information helped strengthen additional cases and increased pressure on organized crime networks across New York. The Gambino family itself did not disappear, but its influence was weakened. Leadership changed, operations became more cautious, and members avoided the public visibility that had defined the Gotti years. Other Mafia families also adjusted. The attention that came with Gotti's high-profile lifestyle had proven dangerous. In the years that followed, many leaders returned to quieter methods: fewer public appearances, fewer meetings, and greater distance between bosses and criminal activity. The fall of Gotti showed how criminal organizations can collapse when pressure from outside forces meets fractures inside their own leadership. When trust breaks down at the top, even the strongest systems can begin to fall apart. The bottom line: when power turns inward, the fall of John Gotti revealed something the Mafia had tried to hide for generations. Criminal empires rarely collapse from a single police raid or arrest. They weaken when pressure from the outside begins to fracture trust on the inside. By the early 1990s, federal surveillance, long investigations, and growing legal risks were closing in on the Gambino leadership. Faced with life in prison, Sammy Gravano chose survival over silence. With that decision, one of the most powerful mafia bosses in America, lost the loyalty that had protected him. It raises a question that still follows organized crime history today. Was betrayal inevitable under Gotti's leadership? Or did modern law enforcement finally become strong enough to break the mafia's oldest rule: silence? For more real stories from the hidden world of organized crime, consider subscribing.